Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, we're from group 8 and today we're going to talk about productivity and creativity in morphology. In other words, how language allow us to create new words from the old one. Let's begin with a few simple examples. From the adjective warm, we get warmth. From happy, we get happiness. And from pure, we get purity. So, what is happening here? Basically, we are taking adjectives and turning them into nouns by adding suffixes like ness or it. This process is called lexeme formation. That is a great example of how language shows creativity and how we can build a new word using the familiar parts. Now, there are three rules behind this creativity. For instance, the suffix attached to adjectives like warm to warmth or true to truth. It attached to adjectives like pure to purity or modern to modernity. And ness attached to adjectives like happy to happiness or dark to darkness. All of these mean the state of being X. But interestingly, not all of them are used equally in modern English. That's where productivity comes in. Productivity in morphology refers to how actively a word formation process is used by speakers today. A productive process is one we still use to form a new word, and unproductive is a process that exists but we don't use it anymore to make new form. For example, the suffix ness is productive. We can easily create words like kindness, coolness, or even something like Venus, and the suffix it also quite productive. It gives we purity, toxicity, and even creative new form like Googleability, but not productive anymore. We still have old words like truth or warm, but if we try to make cool or nice, they sound completely wrong. So, while it's a part of English history, it's no longer part of how we create new words. Now, how does creativity fit in? Creative in language isn't just about making up random words. It's about using productive patterns in imaginative ways. For example, when someone says Googleable or business, those words might not appear in dictionary, but we still understand them instantly. That's because they follow productive morphological rules. So creativity in language work hand in hand with productivity. So we can use productive pattern to invent new meaningful words that fit naturally into English. I think that's all for my part. Next material will be explained by Julie, and thank you.
Hi everyone! In this part, we are going to talk about one of the most important topics in morphology. That is the factors that contribute to productivity. So, it basically explains why some words formation processes can create lots of new words, while others cannot. Before we go into the factors, let's understand what productivity means. In morphology, productivity refers to how freely a rule or pattern of word formation can be used to make new words. For example, the suffix ness, as in happiness or kindness, is very productive because We can easily add it to many adjectives to form nouns. But the suffix as in warmth or depth isn't productive anymore. We don't usually make new words with today. So, why are some processes productive while others are not? According to Lieber, there are three major factors that influence productivity. Let's go through them one by one. The first factor is semantic transparency, which means how clear or predictable the meaning of a new word is from its parts. A morphological process is productive when the meaning of the derived word can be easily understood based on its base and affix. For example, happy to happiness. The meaning is clear. It's about the state of being happy, right? But odd to oddity is less transparent because oddity means a strange thing or peculiarity, not simply the state of being odd. When the word's meaning becomes less predictable or drift away from its base meaning, we call it lexicalized. It's no longer a fresh, productive formation. So, the more transparent the meaning, the more productive the process tends to be. The second factor is frequency of base type. In other words, how many different base forms an affix or rule can attach to. If an affix can be used with a wide range of bases, it's considered highly productive. For example, the suffix ness, like I said before, can attach to almost any adjective, like kindness, darkness, openness, lightness. So, it's very productive. On the other hand, ask, like in Kafkaesque, only works with a few spatial nouns or names. That means it's much less productive. So, the broader the range of bases, the higher the productivity. The third factor is usefulness. So basically, how useful or needed the process is for speakers in everyday communications. If speakers often need new words that fit a certain pattern, that process stays active and productive. For instance, the suffix ness is still useful today because we often need abstract nouns that describe a quality or state, like happiness, sadness, or kindness, like I said before. But the suffix s, as in actress or princess, has become less productive because modern language tends to avoid gendered word forms. So, yes, social and cultural factors can also influence how productive process is. Okay, so productivity in morphology isn't just about linguistic rules. It's also about how people actually use language and then how often they use certain forms and also how relevant those forms are in society. That's all for me.
Hello everyone. Today we'll be focusing on two interconnected themes. First, the restrictions on productivity, which explain why some word formation processes are more limited than others. And second, the practical guide on how to finding words, which teaches us how to discover and analyze new words in everyday language. What is productivity in morphology? In linguistics, productivity refers to how freely and frequently a morphological rule can be used to form new words. For example, the suffix ness is very productive because it easily attaches to many adjectives like happiness, kindness, darkness, and so on. But other affixes like t, as in death or with, are less productive because they hardly ever form new words today. However, Liber reminds us that productivity is not limitless. Each language has its own internal restrictions, such as phonological, semantic, syntactic, etymological, or even cultural, that influence when and how new words can be created. Let's start with phonological restrictions, which deal with the sound patterns of the base word. For example, the suffix "ize", which forms verbs like crystallize or modernize, prefers bases with two or more syllables whose last syllable is not stressed. So we can say hospitalize or legalize, but a word like big eyes sounds awkward and natural. Similarly, the suffix "n", which turns adjectives into verbs, only attaches to bases ending in obstruent sounds like k, t, f, or s. That's why we can say darken, deafen, or brighten, but not slimmen or tallen. Those last two end is sonorant sounds, which are n and l, which violate the phonological rule for this suffix. Next type is semantic restriction, which depends on meaning. Let's take the prefix "un", which creates negatives such as unhappy or unlovely. This prefix generally avoids bases that are already negative in meaning. So, while unhappy makes sense, and sad or unugly sound illogical because sad and ugly are already negative. In short, "un" prefers a positive or neutral base to negate. Another fascinating category is etymological restriction, which involves the historical origin of words. English has roots from both native Germanic and borrowed Latin French sources. Lieber notes that some affixes are selective. The suffix "n", meaning made of, attaches only to native English nouns, giving us wooden and waxen but not metallen or carbonen. Conversely, "ic", as in dramatic, historic, scientific, and aesthetic, attaches mainly to bases of Latin or French origin. So, morphology isn't just about grammar, it also reflects the history and identity of English vocabulary. Next, we have syntactic restrictions, which relate to grammatical structure. Some affixes can only attach to certain kinds of words. For instance, able usually attaches to transitive verbs, that is, verbs that can take an object. That's why lovable or readable are correct, because you can love someone or read something. But snorable and arrivable don't work, because snore and arrive are intransitive. They don't take objects. In short, the grammatical behavior of the base determines whether a new word is acceptable. Now we move to pragmatic restrictions, where cultural or social context limits word creation. Lieber cites an example from the Australian Aboriginal language, which called Jirbo. This language has a suffix "jene", meaning covered with. Technically, you could use it to form covered with honey or covered with water. But in reality, speakers use it only for things considered dirty or unpleasant, like gnagene, meaning covered with faces. So, what counts as acceptable depends partly on cultural perception. Sometimes restrictions apply not to the base, but to the output, the new word itself. For example, in Dutch, The suffix "ed" forms humorous or slightly negative nicknames. From "dick", meaning fat, we get "dickert", meaning fatty or fat guy. And then from "bang", which means afraid, we get "bangert", meaning scaredy cat. However, these words are used only in spoken Dutch, not in formal writing. This shows that even if a rule is productive, its results may be limited to certain registers or social settings. After exploring all these constraints, Liebert provides a practical guide on how to finding words. This is where theory meets real-world observation. Here's how you can do it step by step. First one, collect new unfamiliar words. Write down words you encounter in conversations, books, social media, or even advertisements. Ask yourself, what process created this word? What's its tone or register? Could this pattern be productive? For example, words like adulting, unfriend, or doom scrolling, they didn't exist in a few decades ago. Next, identify the process of formation. Ask yourself, was it made by affixation like unfriend, or compounding as in coffeeholic, or conversion noun to verb as in to Google? And the next step is analyze the context and usage. Is the word formal, humorous, regional, or slang? For instance, cringe-worthy belongs to informal speech, while internationalize is formal. Next, check productivity clues. If many similar words exist on social media, for example, like unfriend or unfollow, the process is likely productive because we encounter it frequently every day, right? And last but not least, compare with dictionary. If the word isn't in the dictionary, but speakers understand it, and that's the evidence of ongoing productivity. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this inspires you to listen more closely to words around you, because every new word tells a story about how language grows.
Alright everyone, and now I'll be talking about ways of measuring productivity in morphology based on section 4.5 of our reading material. So what is productivity? Before we talk about measuring productivity, let's first recall what productivity means in morphology. Productivity refers to how easily or frequently a word formation process can be used to create new words. For example, adding ness to an adjective like kind to form kindness is quite productive because we can do the same with many other adjectives like happiness, sadness, and so on. So the main question in this section is, can we compare how productive one process is compared to another? One simple idea might be to look at dictionary and count how many words are formed by a certain process. For instance, if a dictionary lists many words ending in ness, we might think that ness is very productive. But as the book explains, this method has several problems. First, dictionaries only include words that already exist, not the potential new ones that could still be formed. So, counting dictionary entries doesn't really tell us how productive a process is right now. It only tells us what has already been used often enough to be recorded. Second, less productive processes might actually appear more in dictionaries because their words tend to be less transparent and need to be listed. For example, if a word's meaning can't easily be guessed from its parts, it has to be included in the dictionary. So, ironically, counting dictionary entries could give us the opposite of what we expect. Less productive processes might look more productive. Because of these issues, linguists have tried to find better ways. One early suggestion came from Aronoff in 1976. He proposed measuring productivity by comparing the number of actual words formed with an affix to the number of possible bases that the affix could attach to. For example, if an affix could theoretically attach to 100 possible bases, but we only see it attached to 10, that means it's not very productive. However, this method also has a weakness. It's very difficult to know how many potential bases exist for any given affix. So while it's more logical, it's not very practical to apply in real data. And a more advanced approach was proposed by Bayesian in 1989, and it focuses on the token frequency of derived words in a corpus, that is, in real samples of language use. Bayesian observed that less productive processes often produce words that are more lexicalized, meaning they appear frequently but are not used to form new words. Meanwhile, more productive processes tend to create many new words, which often appear only once or very rarely in a text. So Bayesian suggests using the ratio of hapax legomena, that is, words that occur only once in a corpus, to measure productivity. If a suffix is forming many words that appear only once, it means speakers are still actively creating new words with it. For instance, in one of his studies, Bayesian and Lieber found that this suffix "ness" is more productive than "et". This makes sense because we can easily form new words with "ness", while "et" is used in a more limited way. So to sum up, measuring productivity is not as simple as counting dictionary entries. Aronoff's ratio idea helped shift focus from how many words exist to how many could exist, and Bayesian's method took it further by using real language data, focusing on how often new words actually appear in use. Even though no method is perfect, Bayesian's approach remains one of the most practical and influential ways to estimate morphological productivity today.
Hello everyone, my name is Denis Abigo, and now let's talk about historical changes in productivity in word formation. In morphology, the productivity of a process means how freely and actively it can create new words. But productivity is not fixed. It can change over time. Some affixes may be very productive in one period, but less so in another. To illustrate this, let's look at the English suffix "dom", which usually attaches to nouns to form other nouns. For example, chiefdom, fandom, and stardom. Researchers have tried to measure how productive dom has been throughout history by using data from the Oxford English Dictionary. What they do is identify all the words that end with dom and then note when each one was first recorded in English. By counting how many dom words first appeared in each one century, we can estimate how productive the suffix was during different periods. If we look at figure 4.2, we can see the comparative percentages of first citation of dom per century. The graph starts from the 12th century, which marks the first known uses of dom words. At first, in the 12th century, the productivity of dom was quite high. However, after that, it dropped significantly, especially between the 14th and 18th century. where almost no new dorm words appear. Then, in the 19th century, there was a noticeable rise again in productivity. This means speakers start creating new dorm words after a long period of decline. Now, figure 4.3 shows this in more detail. It breaks down the 19th century into decades. We can see that the number of new dorm words increased steadily throughout the century, with a peak around the 1880s. This suggests that the suffix dom became fashionable again during that time. But why did this happen? There are a few possible explanations. Some 19th century authors like Thomas Carlyle, William Thackeray, Mark Twain, and Sinclair Lewis were known to coin new dorm words. However, we can't be sure if they caused the increase or if they were just reflecting a wider linguistic trend. Another factor noted by Bauer in 2001 is that during the 19th century, the range of bases that dom attached to expanded. Before, dom was used mostly with words for people, like lord, king, or pope, and with a few adjectives like free or wise. But later, it started being used with names for animals, like puppy dom, dog dom, and with everyday nouns, school dom, leaf dom, magazine dom. So the suffix became more flexible and creative in this period. Interestingly, a linguist named Warburg studied this in the 1940s and found that even though dom was still productive, it never regained the extreme popularity it had in the 1880s. So while it didn't disappear, its use became more limited again afterward. This case of dom shows that the productivity of word formation processes can change over time. It can rise, fall, and rise again, depending on social, cultural, and linguistic factors. And of course, dom is just one example. Many other affixes and processes in English and other languages could be studied in a similar way to understand how language evolves over centuries.
Hi everyone, I am Dinda, and today I'll be talking about one of the most interesting topics in morphology, which is productivity versus creativity. Have you ever noticed how some new words sound completely normal while others sound funny or unusual? That difference comes from how our language allows us to create words, sometimes automatically and sometimes intentionally. Let's see how it works. First, let's talk about productivity. In linguistics, productivity means a word formation rule is active and natural in a language. We use it without even thinking about it. For example, when we say happy becomes happiness or kind becomes kindness, we don't stop to analyze it. It just feels right. That's because the suffix ness is productive. Even if someone says calmness or smartness, word we might not use often, we immediately understand what they mean. So productive processes are automatic. We don't notice them, but we use them every day. Now let's move to creativity. Morphological creativity happens when people consciously make a new word, often to sound funny, clever, or to attract attention. For example, think about the word cool, made to contrast with warmth. It sounds playful. That's because the isn't really active anymore in English. When someone uses it, we instantly notice that it's a creative expression. In simple terms, productivity is when we create words without noticing. while creativity is when we intentionally make something new and eye-catching. A good example of this is the suffix "some." We have words like two-some, three-some, and four-some, and those are pretty common. But if someone jokingly says 17-some, it sounds funny and unusual. So this shows how some rules work only within limits. If we stretch those limits, we move from productivity to creativity. We can also see creativity in blending. For example, brunch, breakfast, lunch, smog, smoke, fog, and motel from motor and hotel. Blends often sound fresh and catchy, and they're widely used in advertisements and media because they attract people's attention. Sometimes what used to be productive can become creative over time. For example, the suffix "let" was very common in the past in words like booklet or piglet. But today, if someone says something like toilet to describe a small toy, it sounds funny or cute. That's because "let" isn't as productive as it used to be. When people use it now, they're usually being playful or creative, not following a normal pattern. So this shows that productivity and creativity are not completely separate. They can shift depending on how frequently and naturally a process is used. We can also see this in modern slang. Words like adulting, ANSI, or selfie started out as creative expression on the internet. They were made for fun, to express something new. But now people use them so often that they feel normal. That means creativity can slowly turn into productivity when everyone begins using a word naturally. This chapter discusses how new words are created and why some word formation rules are more active than others. Morphological productivity is the ability of a process to freely form new words, while creativity involves conscious, playful, or attention-catching word making. Several factors affect productivity: the clarity of meaning or transparency, the frequency of possible bases, and the usefulness of the process for communication. However, productivity is often limited by restrictions such as grammatical class, sound patterns, meaning, or word origin. Linguists identify productive patterns using word lists and dictionaries, though not all results are reliable. To measure productivity, corpus-based methods like Bayan's 1989 show that highly productive affixes generate more rare words than less productive ones. Historically, productivity changes over time. Some affixes like dumb lost popularity and later revived in words like fandom or stardom, showing that productivity evolves with culture and usage. Finally, the chapter distinguishes productivity, the rule-based, unnoticed word creation, from creativity, which is deliberate and expressive, as seen in words like cool or brunch. While productive processes keep language systematic, creative ones make it dynamic and engaging. Together, they ensure the continuous growth and flexibility of English vocabulary.